Welcome, dear viewer. I hope you are having a wonderful night. Tonight, I'll be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. I hope you are warm and ready. Let's begin. At 19, I was hired for the role of a correctional officer, one of the youngest there was at the time, working at the most dangerous prison in Australia. I had worked there for 40 years, 7 days, a fortnight, 12-hour shifts. While it sounds like a pretty laid-back role with easy money, the toll it takes on the mind is unimaginable, to the point where no money could encourage me to redo my time working there. There were good times when the men I worked with would better themselves and make something out of their lives afterwards. But I saw all manner of things, from courtyard fights to public masturbation to murder and suicide. But none of that stuck with me through my time there. You would think so, but no. The one thing that stuck with me through my time, there was a short-lived and supernatural experience. There was not a single drop of blood spilled during this experience. Yet it was one of the most horrific and graphic things I have ever witnessed. It was a night shift. Come in at 7 p.m., finish at 7 a.m. We very rarely do night shifts, and this was my first one since finishing training. What was usually a staff of 200 people had dwindled down to about 30 by 10 p.m. We weren't left alone per se, but we generally did the rounds on our own every hour or so. I was prepared and ready to take on the night, and being the youngest on the team and presumably the most naive, there were rounds of light-hearted teasing directed towards me. You'll have aged to 60 by the end of the night. Be aware of the night crazies. Young Padawan. The start of the shift was quiet, almost peaceful, with no issues or weird bumps in the night. The inmates were quiet, dead asleep in their cells. It was probably around 4 in the morning, and the tiredness was really starting to sink in when I saw the figure shift out of the corner of my eye, just outside the unit. At that point, I had just brushed it off as being sleep-deprived and left it to myself, while the other staff members did their rounds. However, when I saw the figure move back to where it had initially moved, my alarm bells started going off quietly at this point. I turned in my chair to face the windows that looked out into the courtyard and focused my eyes on where I saw the figure move, attempting to peer through the darkness. I saw it, just a shadow, but there was something there. Now, usually, if we see something strange, we should radio it in case it was a lost inmate. But this wasn't a human figure. So I put it down to maybe being an animal, which, as large as it was incredibly unlikely. This was a maximum security prison. Nothing larger than a rat should be getting in. It took my tired brain longer than it should have to process this information. The alarm bells, which just moments before were a simple, quiet whisper of something maybe wrong, were now blaring. My now fatigued mind and body were awake, every nerve burning, ready to take action. I leaned over to the control panel and flipped on the outside lights. Nothing was there. Just me and my embarrassingly labored breathing filled the unit. My radio crackled. My supervisor had seen the lights flipped on in the unit she was currently doing rounds in. I had told her I thought I had seen something moving outside, but it was most likely just my eyes playing tricks on me. She had laughed back and said something that caused my skin to break out in a chilled sweat. We said to be careful of the night crazies. This is a lonely time, and the crazies are lively tonight. Really, it's a sentence that doesn't entirely make sense unless crazies is a descriptive word for someone, or the name of something. I brushed it off as she and the team were trying to spook the literal new kid on the block, but still something lingered inside of me that told me that something was not right. I had half an hour of tainted peace before the next encounter with this shadow, except this time it wasn't outside. It had started as a simple, quiet tapping. Maybe it was the wind, but if it was coming from the inside, then maybe one of the inmates was awake and bored. During the day, the inmates would cause a muck if they were confined to their cells, from tapping to banging to blood-curdling screams. The thing was, after a few minutes of thought, it was coming from one of the unoccupied cells. I was still alone at this point, but my unit partner should have been arriving back soon after finishing their rounds. I had stared at that cell door for a few minutes, trying to determine what to do. When the tapping suddenly stopped, my previously furrowed brow softened into a picture of surprise, but mostly relief. Almost immediately after relaxing, the scraping started, a long, painful sound, like someone drawing their nails across a blackboard. I cringed at the sound initially, but then panic took over. It wasn't a loud and deafening sound, but it was there. It was happening when it shouldn't have been. I racked my brain on what to do. Radio in, strange noise coming from an unoccupied cell, going to investigate. My unit partner gave their affirmations and reported that there would only be a few more minutes, that it was probably nothing, and that I didn't need to wait for them to check in on the cell. I wished they had asked me to wait. I stood and walked over to the cell in a daze, without even a single hesitation. This outward confidence was at war with my insides, my heart pounding, my brain screaming for me to stop, and my lungs burning for air. My stomach was tied up in knots, and even with all these warnings that something was terribly, terribly wrong behind that door, I didn't stop myself from reaching for the latch. I opened the door. I hadn't turned on the cell light. They all turned on at the same time, and I didn't want to wake the inmates. The only light poured in from the central unit was blocked by its shape, blocking most of it and letting a few dim streams through. I stepped in. I don't know why. We aren't allowed to step into a cell before inspecting it, but I did it anyway. I stepped inside and into the corner to let more light in, and I saw it. It was facing away from me, a crouched humanoid figure. Its skin was a sickly green or gray color, its knees bent backwards, the kneecaps facing towards me. Its limbs were long and skinny, and its joints had large bulbs protruding from underneath its skin. It didn't even acknowledge me. It just raised its long arms up above its head, placed the tips of its grotesque digits against the concrete wall of the cell, and ever so slowly dragged its fingers down. I had been silent until this point. The fingers were halfway down their path when I let out a small gasp. It paused just for a second, then started to stand, its perverted knees cracking as it did. I was frozen. Its head was sitting on a dangerously long neck that was almost the length of its demented body. It had to stoop so that its head wouldn't hit the roof. Then it started to turn, but just before I saw its face, the room went black. The door had shut, and I crumbled to the floor, screaming for what felt like hours. But it was really only 30 seconds, according to my unit partner, who had run to open the cell door. I was sent home early that day. I expected to hear something about it when I went back to work, but there was nothing, not even lighthearted teasing. It was like nothing had ever happened. A few months after the event, when I had finally settled back into a normal routine, I did some research on the prison. Many old Australian prisons had wretched pasts filled with torture. This particular prison was notorious for, back in the day, abuse, torture, hangings, and riots. I wish I had not researched the history of the goal I worked at, because up until the point I'd convinced myself that I was simply sleep deprived, although that doesn't explain the cell door closing and locking. For the most part, the research brought up nothing too daunting, just the typical graphic and gruesome history of Aussie goals. However, I unearthed the diary entry that was written by a man from those dark times, and one of his last entries really was the nail in the coffin for me. It has stayed burned in my mind for these last 40 years. This is what his entry said. The walls we tap to make songs, are these the same walls we scratch? Our nights are loops, and our hunger destroys our truce. They break our legs, and for daylight, we beg. Instead, they stretch out our necks with their noose. This is a relatively old story that my dad has told me a few times over the years, but with Halloween coming up, it's been on my mind again. I myself have never been able to witness the house, though the description I've been given by multiple men 20-something years after seeing it, gave me a very vivid mental image. To begin, I would like to mention that my father is a highly religious man, a preacher's son, and does not believe in ghosts or anything paranormal in the slightest. Nothing seems to spook him either, but he still swears up and down that he felt something unnatural that scared the shids out of him. Even just from mentioning the story to me on the rare occasion that he would bring it up. Back in the late 80s, he and a few friends would regularly hike over the Waterfall Creek bed behind our farm and would follow the trails up until they eventually met the frontage road off of the interstate. Well, one night they decide to take a different route to go around the backside of another farmer's land, mostly to see the animals because they owned emus and other large pets that weren't common in the local area. Supposedly, after leaving the area and continuing into the woods, at night of all wonderful times, they managed to stumble upon what is described by all 5 men, 20 years later, as a Blair Witch-like house. It was a very old home, and my dad claims that just looking at it gave him this ominous feeling. But of course, they had to go inside and check it out. Inside the house was a vintage cottage-style home that was probably built in the late 40s or early 50s, and the group was instantly met with writing and symbols in strange Latin-like languages, with a few English graffiti pieces that quoted a supposed satanic or pagan worshipping ritual, with certain pieces describing how to sacrifice a human soul to some supposedly demonic deity. My father still claims to this day that certain symbols were painted on the walls in blood, while others were clearly spray paint, and I find it easier to believe because he also worked as a firefighter for years before this happened, and had a lot of experience with having to see human blood, and dismembered bodies on the freeway after car accidents. Past a small living kitchen area was a stairwell that was so small that their shoulders would physically brush either side of the wall as they went up, and the stairs went straight, stopped at a small landing, then turned right, so as you started up, you could not see what might be standing at the top. At the top of the stairs, a door led to a large attic-style bedroom where actual chain manacles and locks hung from one of the walls near a circular window at the end of the room, which was also completely covered in weird symbols, graffiti, and now more obvious and frightening, large dried puddles of blood that had seeped into the floors and walls. Allegedly, once they were upstairs investigating the room, they swear that they heard someone moving up the stairs behind them quickly, but when they looked back, there was no one there. Everyone essentially told me that it sounded almost like heels clacking on wood, and now completely spooked, they rushed back down the stairs to see if someone was playing a prank on them and was hiding downstairs. Surprise, surprise, they found nothing, and no new footprints in the dust and grime that differed from the ones they left on their way in. To keep things interesting, I met with each of the guys separately to ask them about what they remembered, expecting to maybe find a crack or something to prove that maybe they were exaggerating. But when I asked them, I got the same answer from each of them with no hesitation. They got the same details right down to the minute that they entered the house and the minute they left. But here's where it gets really strange. They left the house and, for some unknown reason, decided to try walking back from a different route, using a compass to approach from the east instead of the south. They did this test more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction, yet they always came out at the front entrance of the house, even when the compass and common knowledge of the area showed that it was physically impossible to be at the south end of the house when they moved in a straight line from the north, east, or west. There probably is some scientific explanation for it, but I haven't found one yet. These guys knew those woods literally like the back of their hands, and still do to this day. The final time that the guys came back and found themselves standing at the front door of the house, they began to feel physically ill, verging on feverish, and finally decided that it's time to give up when one of them nearly fainted. As they turned to leave, the man who nearly fainted turned, looked up, and pointed at the circular window at the front of the house on the second story. Everyone looks and immediately sees a tall female figure hunched over standing in the window, watching them, though they see no features on her face other than two large dark-colored eyes. And it sort of shuffled in place slightly before turning and walking away, as if it were heading to the stairs. At the end of the room, at the sight of the figure actually moving, they all took off running through the woods, ending up on the side of the interstate, about 3 miles from my dad's house, where they originally started from. They eventually made it back to my dad's place, though they claimed that they felt as if someone were following them the entire way, and my dad's cousin got up to get some water from the kitchen, only to announce that he swore that he saw the same figure standing outside of the kitchen window near the edge of the woods, close to the woodshed. Thankfully, nothing ever came from the experience other than a collective state of absolute terror when the subject was brought up. They wrote off what his cousin saw as paranoia or pareidolia, though 5 years later, they decided to return to see if the house was still standing. Miraculously, it had fallen in on itself and was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and they never went back. I always joked with my dad and would ask him what he would do if he went back and found the house standing the same way it had back then, trying to give him a reason to let me go and see the place for myself. But with trespassing laws being far more prevalent in today's times, it would be nearly impossible without either getting shot or going to jail, as it was not on our property. I don't know. It always gives me the creeps thinking about it, but I never considered the story to be true until I did this little mock interview with all of the guys. And when I say that these grown men are scared to death by this story, I mean it. Seeing them get physically worked up and frightened by just telling the story really caused me to be less of a skeptic. What do you guys think? Could it be possible that they were just spooked and it caused them to see things? I had a summer job when I was a 15-year-old girl that was a few miles from my house. I lived in a rural wooded area, and my parents never let me go into the woods by myself, but they worked days, and my job started at noon every day, so I had to walk to work. I chose to disobey them and walk through the woods instead of on the road to work because it cut about a mile off of my walk. So every day at the same time, I'd walk through the very abandoned state forest down a deer path for a mile or so until it intercepted a railroad track. Then I'd walk a couple more miles down the railroad tracks into town to my job. Stupid. I know. But I was 15. Taking this path always freaked me out, and I always felt like I was being watched. But it was shorter, less sunny, and less hot, so I ignored my instincts, thinking my parents' influence was just making me paranoid. My parents would pick me up after my shift, unaware of my daily routine. This continued for weeks. One day, I'm walking about a mile from any houses, deep in the woods, and there are 2 porn magazine pages that have been ripped out and placed on the trail facing me. They hadn't been there the day before. I was completely creeped out as they were clearly intentionally placed, and probably for me since very few people utilized this area. But I kept walking because if I turned around at this point, I'd have further to go to get out of the woods. And then there was a huge hill to climb to get back to my house, and no one would be around there to help me anyway. This was a densely wooded area with brambles, dogwood, and rolling hills, so I couldn't see very far in any direction. Suddenly, I could hear someone else walking close by. I stopped, and I would hear them for a split second, and then they would stop. They sounded like they had change in their pocket, so I knew it wasn't an animal. But because of the echo, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Just to check that I wasn't crazy, I stopped once more and heard the same noise, which quickly stopped when I stopped. That's when I knew I was being stalked. My heart was racing with fear, and my vision went blurry. But my instincts told me not to speak or run, but to just keep walking down the dense deer path further into the woods. My gut told me not to look behind me. I could sense there was someone right behind me on the deer path now, but I did not look back. Now I'm a rather short, slightly chubby person, as I always have been. and looking at me, you'd probably assume that I couldn't run very fast. So if you wanted to catch me deep in the woods, you might assume you had plenty of time to do so. And looking back, I think that is exactly what this creep was thinking. But back then, I ran cross country and track and could run a 7-minute mile, and hills were my specialty. I always placed really well on hilly terrain. By no means was I a great runner, but certainly I was likely faster than whatever pedo creep was hanging out in the woods, stalking a little girl. It's not that I was processing this thought at the time. I just instinctually knew not to run. Yet, I kept walking seemingly deeper into the woods because I knew the train track was up ahead, where there would be more space to run without tripping or getting caught in the tree branches. It was terrifying to not look back, but something told me not to. While I walked, I felt like my entire body was shutting down. It's a feeling I've never felt before or after that day. It was the feeling of being prey. Everything went blurry, and I could feel blood pulsing in my ears, and my heart was pounding. I just kept walking like nothing was happening and did not turn around. But I could feel someone, maybe 5 or 10 feet behind me at this point, following me for a good 1/8 of a mile. I didn't turn around. I didn't scream because I knew no one would hear me. As soon as I got nearer the train tracks, which were elevated along a man-made gravel mound, I ran. And then I ran on all fours up the hill, gripping onto weeds to pull myself up faster, and then I sprinted along the tracks as fast as my lungs and legs could carry me. I heard and saw branches snapping below me in the woods, but now I was out in the sun, and the woods were dark, so I couldn't see what was behind the branches. I just kept sprinting. I never even saw the person, but I knew their intentions were awful. I never cut through the woods again. And I didn't mention what happened to my parents until I was 18 and had moved out of the house. I was too afraid of being grounded. This is a long story, so sit back. To give you some background, I'm from a city in the northeast of Scotland in the UK. What happened here didn't just affect me, but also 2 close friends who, for the purposes of this story, we will call Debbie and Joe. We all used to work for Virgin Megastore. I started there back in 2003. Debbie joined in 2006, and Joe joined us in 2007. The entire staff of the store, for the most part, were all close friends. We were all music and movie nerds, so we shared the same interests, sense of humor, etc. Every year, over the Christmas period, we would take on temporary staff as extra help for the volume of customers we would get at that time of year. In 2007, one of our temps was Rory. This is his real name. Most of us hit it off with him brilliantly. The young guy seemed really passionate about music, especially Pink Floyd, which was a big win with Joe, who is one of the greatest guitarists I've ever met, and myself, who grew up on Pink Floyd through my parents. Plus, Rory was a budding filmmaker, and his love of movies seemed to match his love of music. So we would have a lot to chat about and became friends very quickly. It was rare to keep in touch with the work schedule after the Christmas period, but Rory was an exception. He didn't live in the same city as the rest of us, but he kept plenty of contact through text and social media, and would come through to the city to hang out from time to time. Moving forward to Christmas time in 2008, by this point, Virgin Megastore had become Zavvi Entertainment. Remember them? And Rory came back to work with us as a temp, in particular with me. I ran the stockroom in the store, which was the busiest place at Christmas time, and had a history of not having great people to help with how much work would need to be done. So I was happy to be getting someone I knew would work hard and that I could have banter with. He could be a bit annoying, trying to force different live versions of the same Pink Floyd song he'd found on the internet. As I said, I love Pink Floyd, but I also love a lot of music. Nevertheless, I just figured, he's young, and he's passionate, but he's cool. Around this time, he started to put together a self-made Pink Floyd documentary, which he interviewed me and Joe for. And to be honest, he did a fucking great job given the limited tools that he had. Zavvi closed in, February 2009, due to the global credit crunch at the time. All the Zabby staff and Rory kept in touch. We'd all become very close working there. Like I said, fast forward to summer 2010. We had a Zabby reunion night out, which Rory organized. Most of us who still lived in the same city managed to make it along. Joe had moved to Glasgow at this point. It was a really fun night out, and Rory stayed at my place. I should point out that at this point, Rory was preparing to go to America for his second year, working as a camp counselor for Camp America at Camp Wigwam in Maine, Ohio. Since Zabby closed, I'd gotten a new job doing the same thing at another entertainment retail store. And that Christmas, Rory came to work there as a temp, which I was initially fine with. Moving into 2011, Rory starts to raise red flags. Although at the time I didn't see it clearly, he claimed that while in America, he'd gotten a job helping with editing and camera work on the show Burn Notice. At the time, I was like, oh wow, that's cool, man, well done. It didn't seem unbelievable, given that I knew he had talent for filmmaking. To coincide with this, he claimed he was working for Camp America in Florida, which is what led to him working on Burn Notice, where it was at that time filmed. Then, when he was back in Scotland in 2011, it was time for another Zabby reunion, which Rory had to be in charge of, which bothered me as he technically didn't work there when we closed. And like I said, was only a temporary I got sickened with him posting constantly on Facebook about. Essentially, what was just some old friends going to the pub. Again, I was just like, yeah, he's young and easily excited. He's harmless though. Then another red flag was raised. Rory and another friend who shared an interest in filmmaking were talking about doing a film in the city. They spent the whole day looking for locations. And afterwards, when I spoke to Rory, he was like, yeah, we're going to do this and this, making it sound like they had some exciting ideas. Then when I spoke to my other friend about it, he told me all Rory did for the whole day was ask me about my favorite directors. It was a complete waste of time. It made me think, he's young, excitable, and has a tendency to exaggerate, but he's harmless. Move into 2012, Debbie, whom I mentioned at the start of the story, has become a closer figure in his life. Debbie is a nearly 6-foot-tall blonde bombshell, and at the time, one of the nicest people you could ever meet with an amazing sense of humor. We became super close when we worked together, but we were always totally platonic. I always looked at her in a more siblingly way. She would come around to my place for dinner and to watch movies, and I knew all her close friends and a few family members. Herself and Rory went to the cinema a few times and hung out afterwards. There was absolutely nothing wrong with that for now. Move on to Christmas time. Rory's back as a temp for the 3rd year in a row, and by this time he has started to annoy the other staff. While at lunch, he'd sit and brag about all the TV shows he worked on during his summers in the States. Burn Notice, Criminal Minds, and The Wire. Unfortunately, I didn't hear about this at the time because people knew I was friendly with him. They didn't want to seem like they were talking shit about him, as the staff in this job also got along famously. On a personal note, talking with him at work became a bit weird. He started talking to me in a really smug and condescending tone, which, given that I'm 6 years older than the dude and had a hand in him getting his temp jobs every year, and thought I was his friend, didn't appreciate it. Then, around this same time, there's another Zabby night out, due to Roy, Debbie, Joe, who was visiting from Glasgow, myself, and a few others. The day before the said get together, keeping in mind I'm pissed about how Rory is behaving. I get a text from him saying, hey, man, the plan for the night out tomorrow is to go to a pub quiz. Your favorite. Now, I don't go to pub quizzes for tedious personal reasons, and all these friends knew this. So Rory was essentially implying the rest of the guys had planned to go to something I wouldn't go to, which I didn't, as I was super pissed about that text. I kept quiet about it from the others, even though I should have shown how devious he was. Because as it turns out, those guys didn't go to a pub quiz, and there was no intention to. The next day, Joe comes into the shop to speak to me since I'd missed the night out. The whole time, I'm talking to him. Rory is standing next to him in a defensive stance, answering everything I asked Joe, like he was his fucking spokeswoman, which was infuriating because I was at work. I couldn't lose my shit, and Joe is happy. Though lucky he didn't even notice what Rory was doing. Rory was obsessed with Joe because of his talents as a guitar player, to the point of it becoming unhealthy. It was around this time that Debbie started to sense I was having a problem with Rory. And it was true. Contact with him would trigger me to get anxious or angry, because I knew there was something amiss. But Debbie and Joe were constantly just fooled by his false charm, and that's why I kept tolerating him. Because I loved those guys and didn't want to be the cause of drama. In early 2013, Rory finds out his dad has a life-threatening stroke, which he survives but leaves him incredibly disabled. This subsequently turns out to be a lie and a tool to get sympathy from Debbie and Joe. Moving forward to 2014, Joe moves back to town from Glasgow into Debbie's spare room, and this is where Rory really starts to phase me out of the group. Despite having recently hung out with me and me having put him up at my place, which I had done several times over the years at this point, he takes Debbie, Joe, and another ex-Savvy friend to 3 different price gigs around the country. Initially, I was super pissed, but in hindsight, I am relieved. It was Rory that paid for all the tickets for those gigs, which was another red flag. I have to point out that when he wasn't working with me as a temp over Christmas or in America, over the summer working for Camp America and various TV shows, he was making out he was a freelance photographer and video editor, which would be fine, but he didn't have a website, a Facebook page, or anything else as far as I could see to contact him to do said work. Taking that into account, and the fact he's throwing cash to go to concerts around the UK, I was concerned about where his money was coming from. Following the Prince gigs, I had blocked him on social media, as his posts and comments on other people's posts were just annoying, constantly undermining people's opinions on what they're saying or arguing with folks who had a different opinion of him. Debbie took issue with me blocking him and stuck up for him. With hindsight, she'd been groomed by him and had rose-tinted glasses on when looking at him. I caved and got back in touch with him, even though I know now I should have walked away from them all. But like I said before, I dearly loved Debbie and Joe and didn't want to lose their friendship, even though I knew deep down there was something bad about Rory. Throughout 2014, Debbie and Rory got so close that anyone who didn't know them, seeing their Facebook pictures, would think they were a couple. Over the next 2 years, my contact with these guys started to drift. Rory would come around to my place for a bit, and then, when leaving, be like, "I'm away, up to darling Debbie's. I would invite you, but you're not one of the 3 amigos." A lot of the time, he wasn't actually going there, as it would turn out. He even came to my place to stay the night once, saying he needed to catch a flight to the States in the morning to do a video editing job, and then it would turn out he was just going back to the village he lived in at his mom's house. Eventually, I walked away quietly. I took Debbie, Joe, and Rory off of the newsfeed and hid any Facebook posts I made from them. I figured if I see any of them in the street, I'll be polite and just get away ASAP. I started to investigate Rory's claims about his time in America, and I relayed them all to a friend and his flatmate, who himself had lived in America for a long time. They both told me, "Nah man, there's no way he could be doing all that shit." Which is true. If you go to America to work for Camp America, that's all you're allowed to do. And with a bit of research, I found the camp Rory actually worked at, proving he never did Camp America work in Florida. During this time, I had friends who would still follow him on Facebook out of intrigue. They would ask me, where is his money coming from? Rory was going to stadium and arena concerts around the UK at least once a week. Some of these gigs cost as much as Poos 200 a ticket, not to mention travel costs and accommodations. I knew something was up. I knew he wasn't involved in drugs. He would claim he made money from YouTube, but his channel barely had any subscriptions. Plus, all his videos were of copyrighted material, so there was no way he was making money that way. I did wonder if he was making money from editing, or if he was avoiding paying tax. That's the only thing I could think of. Believe me, if I could have afforded a private detective to investigate this guy, I would. During all this time, Debbie and Joe have been hanging out and posting about how great he is, etc. On Facebook, despite the fact that I found Rory had a second Facebook account where the profile picture was of him and Debbie. This was a secret account, and I took a screenshot and showed Debbie, but she was just like, "Oh, isn't that his American account?" Sorry, Debbie, but you were really fucking stupid. Now, let's fast forward to October 2018. By this point, I've severed contact with Rory completely. Missed Debbie's wedding the previous year, where Rory was a bridesman, and haven't seen Joe in a good while either. I'm back at work after lunch for about 5 minutes. Then my friend, who is on her lunch and in the staff room, comes running through to where I am. Hey, have you heard Rory was in court? Which in itself was initially shocking. I was like, what for tax evasion or copyright infringement? No, she said, for making videos of little kids. Between January and November 2017, he was pretending to be a girl online, using YouTube and Omegle to groom young boys. I will leave links to newspaper reports. Once I was told what he'd done, I was in an adrenaline-fueled rage for the next 17 hours, just so pissed off that I'd been right. He was a bad guy, but I just couldn't prove it. I knew my friends had been duped, not to mention all those poor kids that got abused by him. As for his expendable income, I really think he was selling the videos he was making on the dark web for Bitcoin profit. He was the first person ever to mention the dark net to me, but in a way, like, oh, never go to the dark net. He pleaded guilty and got 3 years and 9 months, along with a 5-year sexual harm prevention order, and will be on the sex offenders register for the rest of his life. Thanks for listening. I'm still in touch with Joe, although he's a super busy guy these days. Debbie, unfortunately, I'm not in touch with him now. I know she was mortified by the revelations, but she's married and happy. So I'm just glad she saw the truth eventually, even though it took something so heinous to do so.